This network is a grassroots movement that started with the need to make things better in our community, and it was led by women. And that's really important to state because we live in matriarchal societies as Indigenous people. As a Cree person, that is the society that my people operated in. We were matriarchal, and women were seen as the highest level of government within a community. And so I think that it's something to be recognized that it was women who started this network. That's really important because women are life givers, and they take that into everything that they do. And a big part of our treaties is about our livelihoods. And to have women get together, mothers get together, and want to do something better for everyone is really powerful. It's really meaningful. What it is honoring these territories and those matriarchal societies and the spirit that comes with that, those grandmothers that have went before us. We honor them through this work. And it's all volunteer work. That's also really important to know, that the coordinating committee, which is myself, and there's several other members here in the group who you'll get a chance to meet today, we volunteer our time. We take the time away from our work and our families to do this work because it's crucial. And we don't do this work for us. We do this work for all of you. We do this work for our children. We do this work for the generations that are to come. Because a big part of Treaty was thinking ahead, 7 generations ahead. And so that's what we do with this work. And I know that we're honored to be able to sit in this space with Elder Shirley because she has lived that. She has been a chief for 2 nations, and that's something that not a lot of people get to have that experience, to be a leader for 2 separate nations. And she's had that experience. And she is, what the start of bringing back matriarchal ways to these lands, and when she stepped into that position as a leader and has graciously joined us and has been advising us. And we're honored to be in spaces with treaty elders like Shirley who are promoting these safe spaces and these relationships. And going forward in this presentation, that's what we're focusing on, is to understand that relationship of treaty, to understand that we all have a treaty identity. And in order for us to do that, it's important to always be able to focus on a little bit about who Indigenous treaty partners are, because a lot of that relationship has been severed because of that lack of understanding who was here prior to those treaties. And that's really important to recognize, that the concept of a treaty didn't come here with European settlers. The concept of a treaty was already here. Indigenous people have been having intertribal treaties since time immemorial, since Creator put them here on Turtle Island to be stewards of this land. And they've been exercising those rights to negotiate treaties with other tribes. And the reason they did this was for their subsistence and for the purpose of livelihood, for hunting, gathering, medicinal purposes, livelihood. That was the purpose for having those intertribal treaties. And these treaties spanned right across Turtle Island. You think about, when we talk about, right now we're in the province of Saskatchewan, we've got 5 numbered treaties, but you think back to thousands of years, there's historical treaties in these territories between tribes, between Cree and Soto. That is how we have things. For example, I always refer to powwow, but we'll talk about that in a bit more. When we think about our worldview as Indigenous people, I always refer to this quote from late Elder Danny Muskwa. Danny Muskwa was a treaty elder. I was fortunate enough that through the work that I've done, I've had interactions with him right from university into an adult. And he has this, what he shares, to try to describe to you how Indigenous worldview is and how they view each other and the land. But we have a beautiful tradition and a holistic view of the universe that makes us who we are. In our circle, we need the old and the young, the old to teach and the young to keep the traditions alive. Nothing really dies out in a circle. Things may wear away over time, but they renew again, generation after generation. That is what the circle is about. So for Indigenous worldview, culture is always strong and connected. Things never go away. They're always renewed. And I'm going to let Elder Shirley speak more about what those worldviews are. Because when we say worldview, of course, I'm Cree, she's Soto. We have different worldviews based on our language. But when we talk about treaty as Indigenous people, the worldview that we see all comes from the same places with our values. So I'll let Elder speak to that. I'm going to get us some water.
Thank you, Amy. I was just going to take this time to welcome Larry Oakes. Yes, and he's the son of the late Gordon Oakes, Treaty 4 flag. I talk about that in many areas. But Larry was a chief when I was a chief, so we're chiefs forever, I guess. And that was like maybe 20 years ago, maybe, I can't remember how long. But welcome and nice to see you again. He's also a knowledge keeper, and he's, can I say you're a healer to some level? Maybe, yes, okay, and he does the horse dance and stuff. So Larry is, and Larry, you're sitting by my little sister there, Eleanor. I didn't introduce you. So, yeah, I thought I would, take that time to introduce you. It would have been nice to have people say, I've never seen this group here, but I've seen many more. But I haven't seen these beautiful ladies here. Or have I? I'm getting old, What's your name?
Thank you.
Samantha.
And you're from where?
From Regina.
From Regina?
Yeah. I'm Shayna, and I'm from White Bear, but I live in Wolfe-Keller.
Oh, okay.
I'm Michelle Brass. I'm from Yellow Quill First Nation, living in Fort Capel.
Oh, Michelle Brass, I heard that name.
Yeah, there's
Yeah.
a couple. It's my ex-husband's last name.
Oh, but it was good. I heard good stuff.
Yeah, okay.
So thank you, and I didn't.
And that's Luke.
Luke, I'm sorry, Luke.
The other beautiful lady in the
other beautiful lady. I think I've known. Well, yes, and if you feel you need to introduce yourself, please do. I met this wonderful lady this morning. She owns land. Is how she introduced herself. She's a beautiful lady. We didn't have time to talk. But Bob, I see your comments all the time, and that's good. And everybody else here. I'm not very good for names. I'm not old, but I'm not young either. I am 74 years old, so I may be older than Larry. Were you done? Because I can just briefly. She talked about, really did a very good intro in her talks here just a while ago. But I want to add to the treaties. The treaties are very important, and the treaties, as we all know, was a covenant that was signed. Our ancestors, when they were signing the treaties, whether they were using a stroke of a pen or feather or pat on the back or on the paper, however they did it, they believed sincerely that they were signing these treaties with the Creator being the witness. So the Creator was witnessing, signed these treaties. This is what our ancestors believed, and this is what I believe them to have believed, that because we are very nature-oriented, and we think spiritual is important as well as sacredness, and around that we have a lot of ceremonies and different things that we do out in the lands and at home and in different areas of ceremonies. A lot we don't share because as I was growing up by my kokum, and I went to a residential school only 1 week when I was in 1955, but I was raised by my kokum and uncle, my mother and my aunt, very, very culturally and traditionally. Like many, I only knew my language, Nakaway, and I observed a lot and I learned a lot. The teachings were there, and everything that I think back to those days had a lot of meaning back then and still do today. But there's been a lot of barriers and breakages here and there, and that's where we are today. But my belief for my upbringing and the treaties that my late uncle taught me as a child growing up, and he was a chief too way back when, and he would drag me to these, not drag me, but he would take me, ask me to go to these meetings, and I would dreadfully go though, and because during those times in our home we respected everybody, and my caregivers were very respected. So I would go to these meetings with him, and I would listen, and I'm happy I did, because I guess I learned something back then I didn't know that I was learning at the time. And he talked about the treaties, and that always stuck with me. Our treaties, before they were signed, had a lot of different acts that came about before the treaties. Governments had different acts. There's all these acts about. All these acts seem to always gear towards the land, taking the land or using the land or some sort. After Christopher Columbus figured he discovered Canada, which of course he didn't, and we know that. And I always say the day I die and go to the happy hunting grounds, or heaven, wherever, the spirit world. But if I see Christopher Columbus out there, I'm going to choke him right to the ground. I'm going to choke him to the ground because he lied so much. But anyway, that's what happened back there. As time before he come about, and the beginning of time, and that's a long, long, long time ago. And people often think, well, what is she talking about, beginning of time? She was not around at that time, or how could she know anything? Well, oral history is very strong, and that's where oral little bits and pieces have come to here today in this room. When I look out, though, the beginning of time had the sun, had the skies, had the land, the water, had the animals, the walkers, flyers, crawlers, had the plants, had medicines, had everything back then, and they're still here today. So the beginning of time has come a long way. And at beginning of time, when our Anishinaabe were put on earth, they were put on earth to be stewards of the land, as Amy stated, and they were, I would say, the best conservation officers out there. They did everything everything was done with Creator. Creator was Creator, Mother, Creator. You didn't overkill. You didn't waste. You didn't harm. You didn't wound and let the animal take off. You tried to get that animal and put that animal out of that pain. You didn't destroy the medicines, the water, the trees, everything out there. So that's how important beginning of time has been led up to the treaties. When the treaties were signed, the ancestors were thinking back of all of these. We're thinking that creators here were signing this Mazinite and this white piece of paper, and creators watching us. The reason why you will hear many knowledge keepers, many Anishinaabe old people say, never take your treaties to court. I often wonder why when I was younger, I often wonder why they would say that. And I figured it out myself. I figured it out one day. Well, I said, if the Creator was the witness of these signatures on these treaties, then you don't take that to court, because how can you use Creator as a witness and bring Creator into court? Okay, Creator is Creator. How do you use him? You're taking Creator to court. Creator is above everything. The courts could never stand up to the Creator. So that's what I thought about it, and that's how I still believe that it is. Though our treaties have been, over time, have not been acknowledged, have been put to the side, have been misinterpreted, and broken, I guess I can say broken to many lengths. We still have the treaties, though. We're still there, and that is a very important agreement That is a very important agreement that our ancestors believed Seesequasis was witnessing this. So with that, that's how we see treaties. And in the treaties, everything is loved and taken care of. Everything is supposed to go forward, move forward in a good way. And the same with our families and children and those yet unborn. Now, if just an example before I give the mic to Amy, if people were removed from Earth, if we were all removed from Earth as human beings, life would go on. Earth would go on. The world would go on. The water would be there. The rocks, the trees, the plants, everything would be out there. The animals, they would continue. But if you move one thing from Earth, like water, for example, we'd all be dead. Nothing would be alive. So it's very important to realize that what we've got out there is important, and we need to treat it with respect, with a very high respect, and regard it as something that's real, whether you believe it or not. That's something that I believe it. That's something that I will carry to my to wherever I go after I'm gone. But that's very important, and these teachings and sharing must go on, because that's how we keep things alive. Our young one needs to learn that. And we have storytelling that's important. This is the time we tell it during the winter months. They have teachings, they have learnings, they have sharing, they have everything there. In April, I come to Saskatoon with the Research Scientist Committee, and I come and do a presentation to them with stories and dreams. And these are scientists who have to see facts. Well, I see facts in my stories and dreams. It's going to be interesting. And you know what I'm going to say? If yours is better than mine, and mine's better than you, let's test something. Let's go in that one room, get all the air removed, leave us there for a couple hours. See if you'll come out, see if I'll come out. Who is better than the next? Nobody, I guess. We'll be both dead. Right? Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Shirley. The importance of these treaties, or their sacred agreements, as Elder's sharing, and when you think about all of the importance that went behind those negotiations, for example, Treaty 6, where I come from, or Treaty 4, where Elder comes from, all of those practices of how that treaty between, the British Crown, who was, kind of like the authority over Canada between Indigenous nations, came from those intertribal treaties. Indigenous people had already knew how to have these negotiations. And why we did that is we had to protect ourselves, our cultures, our land. Indigenous people, didn't just live in one central location. They migrated, right, with the seasons, with the growth of certain plants, with the migration of animals. So the only time you had anybody being sedentary and staying in one place was usually just during a winter camp. So in order to protect your tribe and your livelihood, you needed to access the land, and in order to access the land without encroaching on anybody else, you needed to have that intertribal treaty. And they weren't just also about, protecting your livelihood and your tribe, but maintaining that ecology of the land and making sure that you understood that there's laws of the land, laws of creation, and that when we have these agreements with each other to share the land, we honor that. And that was the most important thing with these agreements. And when I teach people about treaties, I always refer to what Turtle Island is. You have to think about, for Indigenous people, prior to any European settlement or any contact from Spanish Inquisition, Indigenous people accessed all of Turtle Island, and there was no borders. And when you think about how that strong that was, you look at mainstream education systems, right? They're going to tell you that the history of maize, corn, is that it comes from 10,000 years ago in Mexico, right? Mexican people don't have a date for when they've grown maize. They've been growing maize since Creator put them there. But you look at mainstream history, it's going to tell you that the first sighting of maize would be in 1640 with the Huron people. So that's going to be what is in Ontario and Quebec. But they're not telling us, how did it get there? How did maize get there? Well, our intertribal treaties that were happening prior to any other settlement. That's how strong our treaties were. That's how strong our agreements were. And our intertribal treaties, they sort of like took that, and that's how we now have our North American Free Trade Act that is mirrored off of these trade systems that Indigenous people had in these territories. And why we had to do that is because of our inherent laws that we had. Whether you were Cree or Soto, you had laws of creation that were given to you, laws of the land and the territory pertaining to which your language group was and where you were living. And you had a right and a responsibility there. For example, I have a right to water. That's my inherent right to water. But I have a responsibility to make sure water is safe and protected for 7 generations ahead. I have a right to the land, 6 inches of topsoil of the land to grow what I need to take care of myself. But I have a responsibility to make sure that the things under that 6 inches of topsoil stay intact so that 7 generations ahead, there's still something there. And so that's what those intertribal treaties were about, was honoring our inherent laws. And Indigenous people of these territories aren't the only ones who had inherent laws. Everybody has inherent laws globally. And everybody is Indigenous. And that's one of the things we need to recognize, is that I'm Indigenous to these territories, where, for example, Doyle's ancestors are Indigenous to their territories. We have to recognize that. And when we do, we recognize that we have our own laws of creation and we have our own inherent rights and responsibilities. And when we recognize that, then it makes it easier for us to be able to understand, what the importance of our treaty relationship is.
And that's the reason the wording in the that's the reasoning and wording in the treaties have that intent, spirit and intent, is the sacredness of it all. And another word for our inherent right is natural law. We've had natural law right from day one, and that's everything that Amy had mentioned. Looking after animals, our plants, our water, and everything that's surrounding us, as well as taking care of ourselves as human beings. So those natural laws have been there from the beginning of time, and very important in keeping them and being that steward of the land and being those good conservation officers. I have a hard time saying that word, but that was all from the beginning of time, and has come over throughout time. And now we have treaties that in my area since September 15, 1874, and in other areas, treaties, 11 treaties across the number of treaties, there's 11 across Canada. So a lot of this treaties are not really taught anywhere, and have not been taught as much as they should have been. Now, though, you see things like this coming up. You see presentation. There's some, I know at one area, the schools have some treaty teachings as well. So that's coming up, but not nearly enough. There's many people out there that don't understand or have not been privy to anything in relation to treaties. So it's time we start to understand and learn about these treaties and respect them as they are. They're here forever and ever, as long as the sun shines, the grass grows, and the rivers flow.
I like that you had shared that, as long as the sun shines, grass grows, rivers flow. That's important, right? Because, that's speaking for how long our relationship lasts, forever. As long as we have land, then we have this relationship to each other. And when we understand treaties, it's most often thought of as just this agreement, like a contract, but it's much more than that. It's a ceremonial process, and it's a lot of agreements, take time when you want to make sure that both sides are being respected. And there were months and years of negotiations to have this agreement. So it's not something that was taken in lightly. And you think about what Indigenous people brought to the table was their prayers, their songs, their ceremonies, the sacred parts of their culture is what they brought, because that's how important this agreement was, is that it was something that was much more than just, wealth or, having some sort of gain. It was about ensuring protection of livelihood, culture, and sustainability for those 7 generations ahead. And thinking about how are you going to bring 2 very differing worldviews and very differing perspectives of why you need treaty, because on one side wants to settle and make a livelihood. One side just wants to survive and maintain what they do have left. And you have one side that comes from a perspective of ownership and personal gain. And then you have one side that's everything's communal and we do everything for the benefit of all. So you've got differing worldviews, differing perspectives coming into that agreement. It helps you to understand why we're only learning about that relationship now. Because you think about this agreement, who was helping at that time to foster that relationship, to help each other understand that we have completely different worldviews. And so when we think about our treaties, we have to remember that these were ceremonies. These weren't just a writing on a piece of paper. These were months and years of entire tribes camping outside of forts. For example, Treaty 6, you've got 2 years of negotiations outside of the fort before an actual agreement. And it's important to know that it's nations that make treaties. Treaties do not make nations. So what that means is we recognize that every nation that negotiated a treaty is their own sovereign nation with their own laws, their own governance, everything. But what instead took place was different policies that happened. We'll touch base on that in a bit, but as Kukum Shirley mentioned when she said spirit and intent of treaties, that's really important. And what that means is that's that sacredness of treaties. That's the parts that you can't write about, the stuff that's in our ceremonies and the treaty territory song and the prayers that take place. That's what spirit and intent is. That relationship of reciprocity. There should be mutual benefit for both treaty partners, but we know that one treaty partner has gained over the other for over 150 years. And so that relationship of reciprocity meant mutual benefit, mutual respect for each other. Make sure that each treaty partner can maintain their livelihood as they had prior to treaty. And continual fulfillment, meaning that we honor that treaty and that relationship as often as we can. So for example, like within the network, we try to annually have pipe ceremony. Treaty partners should be getting together annually and having pipe ceremony and re-singing those songs and saying those prayers together, because that's how we honor treaty. And that's what spirit and intent is those things that we can't see, we can't write, we can't hold it, but it's protected there, like she said, with Creator. Creator is there witness to all of that. Creator gives us those songs, those ceremonies, those prayers. Whether you're Indigenous or settler community or newcomer, we all have stories in our ancestry and in our heritage that connects us to Creator, to God. And that's what's important in the treaties, is that we understand that spirit and intent is there, because that's how we honor that relationship. That's how we honor the land. When you think about, like I mentioned, the depth of a plow. In treaty negotiations, that's all that was offered, was the depth of a plow. You only get 6 inches of topsoil so you can grow what you need to provide for yourself. Well, that's how treaties were all the way up until Treaty 8. They were agricultural treaties. When the government caught wind, so now treaties 9, 10, and 11 are now natural resource treaties. And that's when they started to implement the Natural Resource Transfer Act. So you think about what we're supposed to do is that treaties were about the land. And when you say that, of course we want to maintain our livelihood. But how can you maintain your livelihood if you don't have the land? You have nothing to take care of you. You have nothing for 7 generations ahead. And so when we think about treaties, it was that honoring of the land, preserving the ecology, preserving the animals that we have, and honoring those intertribal treaties and agreements that were already in place to allow Indigenous people, as Elder mentioned, our natural laws. Because as she said, these are to last as long as the sun shines, the grass grows, and the rivers flow. And that was Seesequasis who had said that at Treaty 6 negotiations. And what he had wanted was that if this is what we're agreeing to, it has to be forever. You know, we have to have this forever because we need to make sure that we're continuing. Because for Indigenous people, their sole purpose was to protect the land. They understood that Creator had placed them in the territories that they were placed to be protectors of that land. And that was their purpose. So they needed to make sure that these agreements were going to be forever. Because everything Indigenous people do is 7 generations ahead. You know, the choices that I make now, I can make decisions, but am I making them thinking consciously about how it's going to affect those generations ahead? You know, we should all be consciously aware of the fact there's a climate crisis, and you know, the fact that we hardly have safe drinking water in a lot of our First Nations communities. We only have 18% of our native prairie. Like, we should be really concerned about these types of things, because as treaty people, we're not being very good treaty partners and very good ancestors. We're not leaving enough behind for 7 generations ahead. And that's why things like this network are so important, because it gives opportunity and spaces for us to teach the community about this important relationship that we should have with not only each other, but with the land. Because it's important. It's important to honor each other and the land. Is there anything that you wanted to share?
No, that's
Okay.
fine.
I'm going to move on to quickly like symbolism of treaty mail, because we're talking about the treaty relationship. And from what I've learned, that I've been able to have the honor and the privilege to work alongside many treaty elders. When I first seen a treaty medal, I didn't really know what it was. I just thought it was just this medal given. I didn't know what it meant, that it had, you know, really important symbolism behind it. I thought maybe it was just a token of appreciation given to signatory chiefs from the Crown. But through the interactions with different elders, I had found out that there was much more to that. There was certain themes and symbols within that medal that represented the importance of treaty. But what I want to touch on is what they mentioned about the importance of the relationship, the treaty relationship, which was symbolized in this medal, because you had a settler and a First Nations individual shaking hands. And of course, shaking a hand is something that everyone does so naturally, right? It's an acknowledgement, you're saying hello, you're greeting somebody. But what I was told is that the handshake was much more than that, coming from the perspective of an Indigenous person. Specifically, this was a Soto elder. And they had told me that when you extend your hand out to somebody, you have your thumb pointing up, acknowledging Creator, God, your pointer finger acknowledging the person in front of you. And then the other 3 fingers recognize that you are made up of mind, body, and spirit. And when you have mind, body, spirit, Creator, and another person, you are stronger. But when you come together, you are even more stronger. And that was to talk about that treaty relationship, how important it is that we are dependent on each other. And we need each other for this relationship. That we are more than just a human being, we're mind, body, soul, with a Creator that put us here. And that we got to work together in a good way. Together we are stronger. And that's the importance of that medal, the importance to what that treaty relationship is. And what I was also told was that, from this elder who was Soto, was that when we think about our 7 sacred laws, you know, those are laws of humanity. And he had told me they've been taught, he said, to people that they only belong, he said, to my tribe. He says, no, these are laws of humanity. They belong to everybody. That we must live with these 7 sacred laws. This is how we should guide our daily actions and how we interact with people, because we should always come forward with respect, love, courage, honesty, wisdom, humility, and truth in everything that we do. Because those laws are inherent values of creation that not only apply to human beings, but they apply to the plants, to the animals, to the spirit world. And so when we honor those 7 sacred laws and we live by them, then we're able to easily, we're more able to easily adapt to living the treaty relationship. And we're able to adapt to the fact that there's rights and responsibilities associated. Because when we think about what is treaty, it's that relationship to each other and the land. But there's principles of treaty that we have to remember that guide us so that we can understand that treaty relationship. And so these are in Cree because I'm a Cree person. I identify as both Cree and Michif. My family lineage is from Beardees and Okamasis, but I also come from the Fleuries of Batoche. I'm very proud of my identity because it's an identity that's rooted in Indigenous to this land, but I'm also Indigenous to other lands. And through what I've learned is that I'm okay with the fact that I have Indigenous ancestry and I also have European ancestry. I'm proud of that. I'm proud of where I come from. And my ancestors were living here trying to survive, and my other ancestors were coming here trying to survive as well. And I honor that, and I recognize that. And so those principles of treaties that we have to live by to help us to recognize those things are Wokotowin. We must honor and respect everyone. We must treat everyone like your kin, like your family, everybody. So all treaty partners should treat each other with Wokotowin, like family, like kin. And we should have Miawachitowin, which means that we should get along with each other and respect each other and honor each other at all times. We have to because of Wanuskewin, because we live together on the land. We share together on the land. We have to have the land to provide for ourselves. And Bimatsowin, which is living a good life. We all have to live a good life. We want a good life for ourselves, but we have to live a good life with one another, with creation, with all that lives on this land. And so these principles of treaty, Wokotowin, Miawachitowin, Wanuskewin, Bimatsowin, those are what guide us. Those are what make the treaty relationship. Those are what help us to be good to each other, to be good treaty partners to each other, to be good human beings, and to help us to be good ancestors. Because what we do know is that that relationship was severed for a long time, and we have to acknowledge why. Because Canada breached its treaty with us through the implementation of the Indian Act. The Indian Act is not at all associated with treaties. As Treaty 6 was being negotiated, the Indian Act was being created. So, and it was contradictory to everything that was being agreed upon. We said mutual benefit, mutual respect. You will maintain your livelihood as it had been, but instead, we're placing people on reserves. We're placing a people that travel and migrate with the seasons and the animals and the plants, confining them to one spot. And a lot of times that space doesn't have the suitable soil to grow anything. There is no topsoil, Sometimes a lot of it was in the shield, parts of the Canadian Shield. There's communities like for Moosomin, for example, that were placed directly on rock. You can't grow anything. So you have to think about how that impacted us. The reserve system, pass and permit system. You can't leave the reserve without permission. You want to sell some goods, you got to ask for permission from the Indian agent. Peasant farming policy. You can't grow, you get a certain cap on what you can buy, and if you're going to sell something, the buyer also has to ask for permission from the Indian agent. Ceremony bans, you can't have a drum, you can't speak your language, residential schools, and you think about all the intergenerational trauma that came from that.
Yeah. I just want to say something about the Indian Act. Well, we've all lived that. We're still living the Indian Act. It hasn't been the best act that was put forward. It didn't have the intention of taking care of the First Nation people or other peoples around. That was not the intention. Back in the 50s, my caregivers had a farm, and they grain farmed, they cattle farmed, and we had our gardens and our chickens and whatnot as a child growing up. And I saw this and was old enough to understand and listen as it went on to 61 or 62, that my uncle would raise, we raised cattle, and he would have to he sold cattle once a year, and he would have to get permission from the Indian agent and the farmer instructor first of all, then the Indian agent, to sell those cattle. So I would, at 8, 9, 10 years old, give him a haircut, and he had a bald head. My deceased uncle had hair around, so I would trim all of the hair around. This was my job every year, because he was going to Winnipeg to sell these cattle. Go to Winnipeg, and he would ride in the box cars of these with the cows, with the cattle. He wasn't allowed to ride anywhere else where, people were riding. He rode in those box cars with his animals. Rode there to sold them, come back in those same box cars where the cattle were. Then he would get to Lestock, but this was Muskowkin First Nation. Lestock was the town, on the edge of Lestock. Muskowkin, I guess actually there is land claims there with that town. But then he would go to make that trip to the farmer instructor, to the Indian agent, take that check there. The Indian agent would take that check and give him a few dollars that he would be able to buy us children shoes, some clothing, and some food, and that was it. And they worked hard. My auntie, my mom, and my uncles worked hard in my kokum for those animals to look after all year, to be sold, and money was given to the government, I guess, put in capital, where a lot of that didn't go there. A lot of that didn't go there. It went to the Indian agent, and what he did with it after that, well, there's claims out there. But I've lived that, and I've seen it. As a child, I've seen that and lived it, and I couldn't talk into conversations with my caregivers. I would have to sit and listen and just observe, and this is what I observed and listened. The same thing with grain. If they sold grain, the same thing happened. Any sales would have to go to the Indian agents, then to capital in Ottawa, and much of that didn't get there. So that's why you hear all of these claims. All of these claims out there are very justifiable, and there's reason for them. And it's not that we First Nation people are out there to get something that we didn't have and we don't deserve. No, we've had that, worked hard for that, and it was there. And come the 1961 in Lestock, and we had a bar there. The bars were open to First Nation people and women. Well, from that time on was the first time I'd see people drunk and drinking and violence and whatnot. Then the story goes on to where we are today. So there has been many things that happened, barriers and destroyers, and this the whole idea was to assimilate us to be like our like residential school, to assimilate us to be like our white brothers and sisters. That didn't work. We were Anishinaabe people. We were very close to the environment. We were connected with the environment and everything around us, and that's how we thought. That's how we lived, and that was our belief. So trying to assimilate us into a total alien way of life just didn't work. And today you see that, and many of us have, and I'm not, I don't know how to put this, but in simple words, I always believe today, at this day and age, take the best of both worlds and apply it. Reason I will never go into buffalo hunting or living in teepees or all of that good stuff that my ancestors did. I've come a long way in being taken from that and being forced to have to live the ways of our white brothers and sisters, and which I enjoy to a point where I can drive a car, can ride a horse to work, drive a car, have electricity, can't go out and cut wood anymore and do all of that stuff, though I think that was beautiful, and I lived that as well at home now. And in a tent too. I've lived in a tent in the winter time when I was a little girl with my kokum and my uncle. So all of those good things today we can use, but there are so many of those good things today that have destroyed us and continue to destroy us. When when bannock was first brought to Canada, and everybody thinks, well, First Nation people, that's their food, bannock. Yes, it became our food, but it also became something that was destroying. We got diabetes, we have diabetes, and we don't, I love fried bannock, I love baked bannock, I love bread. And, I have diabetes and high blood pressure, but it's something that, that was thrown to us, and we ate it and we adopted it, and it's like ours, but it isn't. We borrowed it from the people that come across the lands. And will you really hear about that? No. So this bannock eater made a big bad choice in always being that bannock eater. Also eat bread as well, because I too, like Amy, I'm not full-blooded First Nation. I do have, I'm half and half. My dad was non-native, very much white, but I never did meet him. Only found my two brothers last year, a year ago. They love their little Indian maiden sister. I'm older than them, but they're so excited to have met me, and that's the only two brothers I have. And my father only had one daughter, and that's me, and so my brothers don't have children. Their niece and nephews are my children. So that line of my dad's line is really dwindling. But on my Anishinaabe side, I have lots of relatives. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Shirley. I appreciate that you shared that, like, about bannock, right? Because that's, of course, seen as an Indigenous food, but it really was a survival food. And being able to use, like the bread, the wheat, and the flour to make goods came from European settlers. And that's where, when you think about that, that's also kind of like that treaty relationship happening then, because obviously Indigenous people are having, impact because of, settlement and the Indian Act, so they don't have access to the things that they needed, right? So settler communities shared what they knew about how to make bread, how to make these types of goods. So it's a survival food, but of course adopted now as Indigenous food, right? And of course, unfortunately, like, that's one of the impacts of the Indian Act is the diabetes, right? Because of the loss of access to traditional foods. And, that Indian Act impacted, a lot of how Indigenous people are able to access, the land, and are able to have their culture, their livelihood, right? And impacts things such as health. And we think about also, like, the buffalo lost to the prairies. That's really important, and I always share that because I grew up on a buffalo ranch, and so buffalo is really important to me, not only as a Cree person, but to my family, because it's how I was raised. When we think about that, like, there's so much that's missing. It's not only Indigenous people's diet, but think about, the ecology, the land, what's missing if there isn't buffalo here roaming anymore. You think about when, their body goes back into the soil and their bones, and even just their cycle of digestion, everything. You think about what kind of plants aren't growing anymore because we haven't had buffalo. Like, those are important things to think about, that the Indian Act really impacted not only Indigenous people's livelihood, but the environment, right? And so that's really important, because despite this Indian Act and despite the impact to that treaty relationship, there are still things happening. And that's really important to focus on, is that we know the Indian Act and what it did, and it created these spaces, of discrimination, because what happened is this racist policy, this archaic racist policy, has now permeated into social spaces. And so now in society, it seems it's okay to treat Indigenous people a certain way and not not recognize their rights to land. But because we're honoring that relationship in this network, we need to think about how this network came to be. That's really important too, because I mentioned in the beginning how it came to be out of conversations from women, and that's really beautiful because we're matriarchal societies. But it's also important to acknowledge where those conversations initially started and why they happened. And they happened because of the loss of a young man's life and a verdict that showed us that that relationship is so severed, that it's okay for settler community to kill an Indigenous man and there will be no repercussions in the court of law. Of course, with Creator, that's a different story. But in the court of law, where these treaties are supposed to be affirmed and protected, that didn't happen. And it showed all of us that Indigenous people aren't as important as the land is that we've taken from them. And so conversations started to happen. How do we make space safe again? Because Indigenous people didn't feel safe after that. I remember that summer with my dad's company traveling to Swift Current, and we said, gas up in Saskatoon, use the bathroom, don't stop anywhere. Because we were afraid. And so how are we supposed to access our inherent right? How am I supposed to feed my family if I want to feed them elk because that's my inherent right? How am I going to do that? I could lose my life. And those conversations started happening for people that really knew that it was important. And so what happened on a snowy day just like today, in this exact location, a meeting happened like 5 years ago about this network. And look where we are today. 5 years, there's 58 people that have land in the network. They have 38,000 acres given back to Indigenous people so they can, have their inherent rights, which are protected and affirmed in treaty. These photos are from a land sharing event we had. These photos are from after the pipe ceremony. So we didn't photograph the pipe ceremony, and that's not what's being photographed. But these photos are really, really important because they're from a really monumental moment in all of us lives who got to experience it. And it'll be one of those moments in my life that I'll always hold dear. And will tell me that the work that we're doing is probably some of the most important work that I will ever do in my entire life. And it was affirmed to me in that moment because we just had a pipe ceremony, and I stood up and I looked and I seen settler community and Indigenous community sitting together in a circle, and they just had ceremony, just like my ancestors did over 150 years ago when Treaty 6 was negotiated. This is what the treaty relationship is. I said, this is what our ancestors wanted, for us to sit together like this in this space and know that we belong, that our families belong, that we belong to the land, and we all deserve to make a life here, and that whatever our language is and our beliefs, whether they're religious or spiritual, it all matters. It's all important. And that in that moment, I knew we were doing something that nobody else had ever done before. And they'd done it before, but we were doing it again. Like, we were really bringing that spirit back. Over 150 years later, ceremony together between treaty partners. And that was one of the most profound moments of my life. Like, I have children, so they'd be like, what? Wasn't it when we were born? But it was amazing. I felt our ancestors there. I can't explain it, but I felt it. I felt our ancestors there. And I was so thankful to the pipe carrier who came, because he said it was the very first time he ever brought his pipe among settler community. And he did it again the next summer. And he always says that he's always willing to, because he sees the importance of this work, the importance of honoring that treaty relationship, understanding Wakotuin, understanding Miowachituin, Wanuskewin, Bimatsuin, right? When we recognize that we're all kin and we should share the land together and treat each other with the utmost respect, because we should all live a good life, and that's what our purpose is, right? Because that treaty relationship, that's where the spirit and intent is rooted in, and when we have a treaty relationship with each other and the land and we honor treaty and we recognize that spirit and intent, is what we really want is like to have that shared understanding of our treaty identity. We all want to recognize we have treaty identity and that we should have these relationships with each other based on reciprocity, mutual benefit and respect. Everyone should be benefiting the same. No treaty partner ahead of the other anymore. You know, and respecting Indigenous people, their culture and their livelihood. You know, respecting that they need access to land, you know, so that we can have these equitable systems in society when we understand each other and the relationships we have with each other for the purpose of, right, like honoring that treaty relationship, you know, where we work together daily to be a good treaty partner. And we live those treaty principles and also those laws. We recognize that you have a treaty identity and that you have roles and responsibilities. We have to think 7 generations ahead, like what are we going to leave behind? You know, the network is starting off, you know, of course, as safe spaces for Indigenous people to exercise their inherent rights. But together, collectively, the bigger picture should be thinking about sustainable practices, because that's what we were supposed to do, was to work together to maintain and think 7 generations ahead. It's important for settler community and Indigenous community to have access to land. You know, and despite, you know, when I talked about like the breach of treaty, right, with the Indian Act and the hardships and the things that Indigenous people have went through, intergenerational traumas, and the fact that there has been that severed relationship, we have to think about that quote that I shared from Elder Muskwa, late Elder Danny Muskwa, when he talked about our worldview, because we need to apply that thought to this relationship of treaty that we have with each other, where he says nothing really dies out in a circle. Things might get old and wear away, but they renew again generation after generation. That is what the circle is about. So that relationship was severed for a bit because of that, in that breach of treaty with the Indian Act. But here we are together, trying, you know, and we're making that circle. We're coming full circle again. I see it. We're starting to honor treaty and do things the way our ancestors had intended for us. And with that, I thank you for letting us share. I'm gonna let Cookham Shirley have the final word on our session. And I just thank you for allowing me to share with you what I know that's dear to my heart and is important to me. I think this information should always be shared, and that everybody should know how important these treaties are, not just to me as a Cree person, but to everyone as human beings, because we all need this land to live. And if we don't have the land, and we don't have fresh water, and we don't have clean air, we have nothing.
Thank you. I really don't have much to add to that. She's touched on a lot, and I think that's a lot of information for the participants in this room to you know, to think about. Also, if there's any questions or any comments out there, is there time for that?
It'll be 5 minutes.
Yeah. Is there? If anybody wants to, you know, if there's questions or.
You're like, no.
But
Really?
no, nobody wants. Okay. Okay then, but that tells
we can
me.
visit over the break, though. We
Yeah.
have a break.
Oh, yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
That tells me we were not boring. We overloaded you. Yes.
I just wanted to add to, you know,